Marcus Bennett stood quietly outside the towering glass doors of Bennett Realty Group, the company his father had built from the ground up. The morning rush of sharp suits and polished shoes passed him without a second glance. He wore a simple grey hoodie, worn-out jeans and a faded backpack slung over his shoulder, an outfit that drew no admiration, only assumptions. To the world he looked like an outsider. But what no one realized was that he wasn't just another applicant. He was the firstborn son of David Bennett, the company's founder and CEO. And today, Marcus wasn't here to be seen. He was here to observe. Reports had been trickling in for months, anonymous complaints, unsettling whispers from former staff, and troubling online reviews. They all told a similar story, a toxic work culture where discrimination quietly festered behind boardroom doors. Marcus, who had spent years abroad studying organizational leadership and workplace equity, had come back not with a press release or a title, but with a plan. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to experience firsthand what the employees endured when they believed no one important was watching, and so he returned not as the heir, but as a janitor. The moment he entered the lobby, the change in atmosphere was immediate. The receptionists barely lifted their eyes. One glanced over, exchanged a look with the other, and went back to typing. Then came the voice, sharp, dismissive. "Deliveries go around the back," barked a woman in a navy uniform. Her name tag read Rachel Monroe, and she wasted no time making her disapproval known. Marcus smiled slightly and replied, "Actually, I'm here to apply for the open position on the cleaning crew." Rachel scoffed audibly, her eyes scanning him like she was inspecting a stain on her freshly scrubbed floors. "Figures," she muttered. As Rachel led him through a back hallway, they passed Todd Miller, a senior operations manager. Todd was the kind of man who believed appearances were everything. Pressed suits, perfect posture, and zero patience for anyone who didn't fit the image of corporate success. He gave Marcus a once-over and smirked. "We're hiring janitors now," he said loud enough for the others in the hallway to hear. A few chuckles echoed. Marcus felt the sting of their assumptions, but he didn't flinch. He only nodded, replying politely, "Glad to have the opportunity." Rachel handed Marcus a uniform and pointed him to the supply room with barely concealed annoyance. "Try not to mess anything up," she snapped, before walking off alone in the dimly lit room. Marcus unfolded the navy blue janitor shirt and stared at the stitched logo of the company that bore his family name. He slipped the shirt over his head, slowly breathing in the weight of what this mission required. He wasn't here to play games. He was here to test the very foundation of the company's values. And so he put on the uniform, not as a disguise, but as armor. As he stepped out into the hallway, mop and bucket in hand, Marcus knew he was crossing a threshold. For the next few days he would scrub floors, clean windows and empty trash bins while being ignored, judged or laughed at. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth, how people treated others when they thought no one important was watching. This wasn't about catching a single bad actor. It was about exposing a system that rewarded arrogance and punished humility. And for that, Marcus needed to walk the halls not as a boss, but as someone who to them didn't matter. What no one knew, not Rachel, not Todd, not even the eager interns rushing to deliver coffee, was that the man they were about to belittle had the power to change their lives forever. But that would come later. For now, Marcus was ready to learn to listen and to endure, because real change never begins from the top of a tower. It begins on the floor with a mop in one hand and purpose in the other. The first week for Marcus Bennett in his new role as a janitor wasn't just challenging, it was revealing. From the moment he stepped onto the maintenance floor, Rachel Monroe made her disdain crystal clear. She barked orders without even making eye contact, criticized his work with a sneer, and micromanaged every sweep of his mop like she was commanding a child. "I don't care how you did it wherever you came from," she snapped one morning, pointing at a barely visible streak on the window. "Here we do it my way, and my way means spotless." Marcus had cleaned that window 3 times. It didn't matter. To Rachel, no effort from him would ever be enough, because she never expected him to succeed. What began as passive aggression quickly escalated into public humiliation. Rachel took every opportunity to correct Marcus in front of other employees. She'd roll her eyes loudly when he walked by. She once tossed a rag at his chest when he finished wiping down the break room counter and said, "Try doing it like someone with a brain next time." Her comments weren't just harsh, they were dehumanizing. Marcus kept his cool, nodding, apologizing when needed, and storing every moment in the back of his mind. He wasn't just experiencing their cruelty, he was documenting it. Then there was Todd Miller, the polished, smug operations manager who treated Marcus like background noise on a good day and like garbage on the rest. Todd would walk past him in the hallway and mutter, "Make sure you get under the corners, boy." The first time Marcus heard it, he paused. The word echoed, not just as an insult, but as a deliberate power play. Todd wasn't unaware of what he was saying. He wanted Marcus to feel small. Worse, Todd made it a game. One afternoon, Marcus finished mopping the lobby floor, only for Todd to walk by with his coffee and accidentally spill it. Without missing a beat, he looked down at Marcus and said, "Oops, clean that up, would you?" The nearby employees chuckled. Some looked away. No one said a word. Over time, Marcus noticed the pattern. The staff had created an unspoken hierarchy where your appearance, your accent, and the polish of your shoes determined your value. Most of them weren't blatantly cruel. They didn't need to be. Their silence was enough. When Rachel mocked him in the break room, no one defended him. When Todd knocked over a trash can and told Marcus to earn his paycheck, the others just kept typing, pretending they didn't hear. Every smirk, every sideways glance, it all said the same thing. "You don't belong here." But Marcus didn't lash out. He didn't break character. Instead, he paid attention. He watched how easily some employees adapted to the culture, how quickly they normalized cruelty when they believed they had nothing to lose. He noticed the difference in how they greeted interns in suits versus janitors in coveralls. And he especially noticed how none of them questioned Todd's behavior. In fact, some seemed to admire it, laughing a little too hard at his jokes, echoing his dismissive tone when talking to the cleaning staff. The rot in the company wasn't just at the top, it had spread. Still in the midst of it all, Marcus found moments of clarity. He realized that if he had walked in wearing a tailored blazer and a $500 watch, these same people would have treated him with reverence. They would have smiled, shaken his hand, offered him coffee. But in a janitor's uniform with brown skin and quiet confidence, he was treated like an inconvenience at best. That truth burned, but it also empowered him because now he wasn't guessing. He didn't need a report. He had seen it, felt it, lived it. By the end of his first week, Marcus had a clear picture of what his father's empire had become: a place where power protected the cruel, where silence excused injustice, and where no one thought twice about mocking the man who was about to become their boss. And yet, through all of it, Marcus kept sweeping. He kept scrubbing, because he knew something they didn't. The floor they walked over today was the same floor he would rise from tomorrow. And when that day came, every insult, every smirk, every cruel laugh, they would all remember exactly how they treated the janitor. The day started like most others, quiet, cold, and full of silent stares, as Marcus wheeled his mop bucket down the hallway of the 12th floor. It was the executive level, a place where glass walls glistened and every piece of furniture cost more than what a janitor earned in a week. He moved methodically, carefully wiping down surfaces and polishing the sleek mahogany table in the main conference room. It was the kind of space where million-dollar decisions were made. But today, it would be the stage for something far more revealing. As Marcus wiped the last edge of the table, he felt a presence behind him. Sharp heels clicking a familiar bitterness in the air, Rachel Monroe had arrived. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her arms crossed and face twisted into its usual scowl. Without a word, she stormed into the room and scanned the table as though she were searching for a reason to unleash whatever anger had been brewing inside her. "This is filthy," she barked, pointing at the very surface Marcus had just polished. He looked at her calmly, then back at the table. The wood gleamed under the overhead lights. There wasn't a single fingerprint in sight. "I just cleaned it," he said. his voice steady, measured. Rachel didn't even blink. With deliberate cruelty, she reached for a full cup of coffee, still steaming, and without hesitation hurled it across the table. The dark liquid splashed everywhere. It streaked across the polished wood, dripped down the sides, and pooled on the floor. Gasps echoed from the hallway, where several employees had been passing by, their footsteps now frozen as they witnessed the act. Rachel crossed her arms and stared Marcus down with a wicked glare. "Now clean it again," she demanded, her voice louder than necessary. It wasn't just a command, it was a show, a performance meant to degrade. She wasn't correcting a mistake, she was proving a point. To everyone watching, it was crystal clear this was not about cleanliness, it was about control. The silence that followed was thick, tense. Eyes darted from Rachel to Marcus, waiting to see how he'd respond. A lesser man might have broken, snapped back, walked out, or even cried, but Marcus stood perfectly still. He looked at the coffee, then at the crowd, and then slowly turned back to Rachel. There was no anger in his face, no fear, only calm, controlled, quiet power. He bent down, grabbed a clean rag from his cot, and began to wipe. Not because he accepted her treatment, but because he knew what she didn't. Her performance had just exposed the very culture he came to confront. Rachel believed she had won something in that moment. Her smirk widened, thinking she'd reminded the janitor of his place. But in truth, she had just confirmed everything Marcus suspected. The abuse wasn't hidden. It was proudly paraded. The problem wasn't just her. It was the system that had allowed her to believe this behavior was normal, even acceptable. She had just become the living, breathing proof of everything wrong with Bennett Realty Group. And now every witness in that hallway had seen it too. Some still watched in awkward silence. A few turned away, pretending they didn't see what they saw, but the truth lingered like the smell of coffee on the air. As Marcus finished cleaning, he didn't rush. He moved with quiet precision, letting every second stretch just a bit longer. Rachel stood over him, arms still crossed, as if waiting for a reaction that never came. Because Marcus didn't need to fight back, not yet. His moment was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't be with rags or mops. It would be with words, with truth, and with a title that would silence every smirk in the room. He stood up, folded the now coffee-stained rag, and gave Rachel a look not of anger, but of certainty. The kind of look that says, "I see you, and soon you'll see me too." That moment marked a shift, not just for Marcus, but for the entire office. The power dynamic had been cracked, if not shattered. And though no one knew it yet, the woman who had just thrown coffee in front of a crowd would soon be standing in front of that same crowd, answering for everything she'd done. The morning air in the lobby of Bennett Realty Group was unusually charged, as if the walls themselves sensed something significant was about to happen. Word had spread quickly. David Bennett, the founder and CEO, was coming to the office for a surprise announcement. Phones buzzed, whispers rippled through departments, and nervous energy floated like static between cubicles. Executives straightened their ties, assistants double-checked schedules, and even the interns made sure not a single document sat out of place. This wasn't just any visit, this was the kind of arrival that meant change was coming, and everyone wanted to be on the right side of it. Todd Miller stood near the reception desk, gleaming with confidence. He adjusted his watch, smoothed the front of his suit, and flashed his practiced smile to everyone who passed. To him, this was opportunity incarnate, a rare chance to impress the boss, shake a few hands, and maybe plant the seed for a promotion. New leadership, he mused to Rachel Monroe, who stood beside him in a navy blazer and a calculated expression. Probably some Ivy League golden boy from corporate, he added with a chuckle. Rachel smirked. Let's just hope he doesn't come in thinking he knows more than the rest of us. Neither of them had the slightest idea how wrong they were. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the elevator doors opened and the building seemed to hold its breath. David Bennett stepped out tall and composed in a sleek charcoal suit. His silver hair neatly parted his presence, instantly commanding. Flanked by two senior advisors, he walked through the lobby, slowly nodding politely to the crowd that had gathered. The room fell silent, not out of fear but respect. For decades, David had been the face of Bennett Realty Group, a builder, a strategist, a visionary. But today he wasn't here just as a leader. He was here as a father. He stopped in the center of the room, turned to face his employees, and offered a small, warm smile. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice." He began, his voice steady and clear. "Today marks an important new chapter in the legacy of this company." The staff leaned in, eager, anticipating the name of some high-profile executive, maybe someone they'd met briefly on Zoom or read about in company newsletters. In the corner, Todd nudged Rachel, whispering, "I bet it's Anderson from Chicago. He's been eyeing this position for years." Rachel nodded, folding her arms, as if bracing for a predictable announcement. But what came next was anything but. David paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to command full attention. "It is my great honor to announce that the new Chief Executive Officer of Bennett Realty Group is my son." A wave of murmurs shot through the room. People looked at each other in confusion. "His son," someone whispered. "I didn't even know he had a son working here." Others exchanged puzzled glances, searching the crowd for someone in a sharp suit, perhaps standing just behind David. But there was no such figure, not where they expected at least. Then David turned to the left, and his eyes landed on a man most had overlooked every day since he arrived, a man still wearing a Navy janitor uniform, standing silently by his mop cart, his expression unreadable. Marcus David said with pride, "Come join me." For a moment, the building stood still. You could hear a paperclip drop. All eyes swiveled to the janitor. Todd blinked in disbelief. Rachel's jaw slackened. The man they had mocked, dismissed, and humiliated was now walking calmly, confidently toward the center of the room. Marcus didn't rush. He didn't gloat. He simply walked with the same quiet poise he had carried all week. But now every step carried weight. Every gaze he met dropped quickly. The silence that once surrounded him out of disregard now came from shock. He stepped beside his father, nodded slightly, and turned to face the team that had shown him exactly who they were when they thought he was no one. David placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "This," he said, "is the future of Bennett Realty Group." He has seen this company from a perspective most of us have never dared to. And starting today, he will lead us with integrity, with empathy, and with purpose. There were no claps, no cheers, only stunned silence and pounding hearts. Because in that moment, every cruel word, every rolled eye, every spilled coffee, they all returned with brutal clarity. And for those who had watched, who had laughed, or who had simply looked away, it was too late to take it back. The janitor was now the CEO. And nothing in that office would ever be the same again. For a few seconds after Marcus Bennett stepped beside his father, the room existed in a strange kind of silence, one not born from respect or reverence, but from disbelief. No one moved, no one breathed. Dozens of employees stood frozen in place, the reality of the moment crashing down like a wave too large to run from. This man, the janitor they had walked past, ordered around, laughed at, was now the CEO of Bennett Realty Group. And every person in that lobby knew with terrifying clarity that they had completely misjudged him. Marcus didn't need to say a word for the message to land. His presence alone, now elevated by the truth, was thunderous. He scanned the room, slowly making eye contact with the people who had once looked through him. They dropped their gazes, the weight of their own guilt far too heavy to hold. His uniform was still stained with coffee, his hands still bore the calluses of hard labor, but his voice, when it finally broke, the silence was commanding. "I know what you're all thinking." Marcus said, his tone even. "How could this happen? How could someone like me end up here in the corner?" Todd Miller stood frozen, his face pale and unreadable. The color had drained from his usually confident expression. He swallowed, hard eyes darting from Marcus to David Bennett, as if hoping for some last-minute explanation, some twist that might erase the consequences he knew were coming. Rachel Monroe stood just a few feet from him, her posture no longer upright, her mouth slightly open as if trying to form an excuse. Her arms had dropped to her sides, hands trembling as she realized the extent of her mistake. Every cruel word, every sarcastic smirk. Marcus remembered them all. "I've walked these halls as someone invisible," Marcus continued. I've scrubbed your floors, emptied your trash, and cleaned up messes you made just to see how I'd react." His eyes swept over the crowd, pausing briefly on Todd, then Rachel. "I've listened to the jokes, the whispers, the assumptions. I've been called boy, told to know my place, and treated like I didn't belong. And through it all, I smiled. Not because I was weak, but because I was watching murmurs rippled through the group, and a few employees took small steps backward, distancing themselves from the now exposed perpetrators of the office's darkest habits. Marcus took a slow step forward, his gaze unwavering. "You see, the real test of character isn't how you treat your boss," he said. "It's how you treat someone when you think they have nothing to offer you." A hush fell again. The words landed like stone. People were no longer just shocked, they were ashamed. The hierarchy they had once clung to had crumbled in a single morning, and standing atop the rubble was a man they had tried to bury with condescension. He had watched them not as a victim, but as a leader taking notes. In the middle of the crowd, a few employees exchanged nervous glances. Some had remained quiet throughout the week, watching, unsure, hesitant to intervene. Others had laughed along with Todd and Rachel, complicit by silence. Now they were all equal in their discomfort. No title, no department, no performance record could shield them from the truth. Marcus had seen them all, and he remembered who had stood for dignity and who had helped tear it down. A man they thought was beneath them now stood in judgment, and he didn't need to raise his voice to hold their future in his hands. The room felt heavier with each passing second. Marcus turned toward his father, who stood nearby with arms crossed, silently observing. David gave a faint nod, a gesture of quiet approval, but this moment, this reckoning, belonged solely to his son. Marcus looked once more around the room. "You thought I was the janitor," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective, "and for a week I was. But more importantly, I was listening, I was learning, and now I'm leading. So if you've treated others the way you treated me, this is your wake-up call, because that culture ends today." The silence in the room was suffocating. No one dared to move, not even to breathe too loudly. All eyes were fixed on Marcus Bennett, still standing in his janitor uniform, but now commanding the entire lobby with nothing more than presence and truth. His calm demeanor only heightened the tension. This wasn't a speech anymore. This was a reckoning. A corporate mirror held up to every person in that building, and as he scanned the faces before him, it was clear that some people knew exactly what was coming next. Marcus turned toward Todd Miller, the man who had mocked him, humiliated him, and used his title as a weapon. Todd Marcus said, his voice neither raised nor rushed, "You made it your mission to make me feel small. You dropped trash in my path, spilled coffee you didn't intend to drink, and referred to me like I was less than human. You treated power like it was protection, not responsibility." Todd opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize or plead, but Marcus raised a hand. The motion was subtle but final. "You're no longer employed here," Marcus said, effective immediately. A wave of shock rolled through the room, but no one interrupted. Todd's hands trembled as he stood there, stripped not by security, but by truth. Rachel Monroe didn't wait to be addressed. She took a step forward, her face pale and tight with desperation. "Sir, I was just—" she started, but Marcus didn't let her finish. "Rachel," he said evenly, "you threw coffee on a table I had just cleaned and told me to clean it again in front of a hallway full of people. You didn't just supervise you. Humiliated. You used authority as cruelty." Rachel shook her head slightly, searching for something, anything to hold on to. "It was company policy," she muttered. Marcus gave a short, humorless laugh. "Throwing coffee is not company policy. You are no longer a supervisor. In fact, you're no longer part of this company at all." Her breath caught in her throat, and this time she said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The weight of Marcus's words lingered like smoke. They didn't echo. They settled quietly, like justice long overdue. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, Marcus did something no one expected. He turned toward the back of the room, where a young woman stood half hidden behind a cluster of desks. Her name was Emily Dawson. She had been the only one during his time as a janitor who had spoken to him like a person. She'd offered a bottle of water when he looked exhausted. She'd smiled genuinely without agenda or assumption. It was a small gesture, but in a place so devoid of kindness it had shined like gold. Emily Marcus called out gently. She blinked in surprise and stepped forward, unsure of why he was addressing her. You treated me with respect when no one else did. Not because you thought I was someone important, but because you believed every person deserved decency. Her eyes widened. As my first decision as CEO, he continued, I'm promoting you. Effective immediately, you'll be moving into a leadership role in employee experience and workplace culture. Gasps followed, but this time they were not of disbelief, but of admiration. Emily brought her hands to her mouth, stunned, overwhelmed with emotion. She hadn't expected recognition. She had simply been kind. David Bennett, who had watched everything unfold silently from the side, finally stepped forward. His face was unreadable at first. Part pride, part regret. He looked at Marcus, then at the employees who remained. My son did what I never had the courage to do, he said quietly. He walked through this company without a title, and he saw the truth. I chose not to see, and I am proud of him deeply. But I am also ashamed of what we allowed this place to become. That admission coming from the founder himself hit harder than any punishment. It was a confession and a promise. Together, father and son stood before the team. One represented the legacy that had been tarnished, the other, a future built on clarity and character. Marcus looked around once more, his voice steady. From this point on, leadership will be earned through empathy. Respect will be mandatory, not optional, and kindness will no longer be an exception. It will be the standard. The room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. The silence was no longer from fear. It was from realization. Things had changed. Accountability had arrived. And justice was finally here. The air inside the Bennett Realty Group headquarters was no longer heavy with tension. It was quiet with anticipation. The reckoning had come and gone. Those who had abused their power were no longer standing. Those who had watched in silence now stood humbled, and in the center of it all was Marcus Bennett. Not as the janitor they once dismissed, but as the new CEO, the voice of a company about to be reborn. He stepped forward the conference room behind him, his gaze sweeping across every person present. What he spoke next wouldn't be a reprimand. It would be a vision. Marcus didn't speak loudly, yet his words filled the space with weight and intention. Dignity, he began. It's a word we print on posters and put in training manuals, but over the last week I saw how far we've strayed from it. I've seen people judged by their uniforms, ignored for their silence, and mocked for their background. And if I hadn't worn this uniform, if I hadn't been treated the way I was, we wouldn't be standing here having this conversation, because until today we mistook performance for character, titles for integrity. He paused, letting the truth settle in. No one looked away. Not anymore. For a company like ours, Marcus continued, growth cannot be measured by profits alone. Real growth is seen in how we treat the people who keep the lights on, the people who clean our floors, answer our phones, handle our accounts, and meet our clients. From this day forward, no one is invisible. Every person matters. Every voice deserves to be heard. He took a breath, grounding the moment. This isn't about punishment. It's about responsibility. It's about setting a standard that reflects who we claim to be. For the first time in years, the mission statement engraved on the lobby wall didn't feel like a slogan. It felt like a promise. Then came the shift from reflection to action. Marcus announced sweeping reforms that would touch every level of the organization. Effective immediately, he said, we are implementing a comprehensive anti-discrimination policy with zero tolerance for racial bias, harassment, or any behavior that undermines dignity. Leadership evaluations will now include empathy benchmarks. All managers, myself included, will undergo training focused on equity, accountability, and ethical leadership. Around the room, a few employees glanced at each other with cautious hope. These weren't just words, they were policy changes with teeth. But perhaps most powerful of all was what Marcus said next. This company will not be run by fear. We will not lead by intimidation, nor climb by stepping on those beneath us. That era is over, his voice never wavered. I don't believe in revenge, I believe in redemption. I believe in creating a culture where people can grow, not because they're perfect, but because they're willing to be better. And if we're going to succeed together, we have to rebuild trust. Not with statements, but with actions, day by day, person by person. As Marcus wrapped up his message, there was no applause, just a room full of people, genuinely moved, thoughtfully shaken. For once, a leader had not spoken from a pedestal, but from experience. He had worn their fears, he had carried their burdens, and now he stood before them, not to boast, but to lead. Let this be the moment we remember. He said not for who fell, but for what we chose to build next. With that, Marcus stepped back slightly and nodded, not as a CEO speaking to subordinates, but as a man inviting others to rise with him. The future of Bennett Realty Group had just changed, and every soul in that room knew it. The next morning, the company felt different. The lobby was still bathed in sunlight, the same glass doors open to the same city street, and the elevators still hummed quietly up and down their tracks. But the energy inside Bennett Realty Group had shifted. Where fear once lingered, there was now reflection. Where hierarchy had defined every interaction, respect was beginning to take root. At the center of this transformation stood Marcus Bennett, no longer in a janitor's uniform, but in a tailored navy suit. Not because he needed it to prove his role, but because he had earned it in the most honest way a leader can from the ground up. Marcus officially assumed his position as CEO that morning, standing beside his father, David Bennett, in a quiet but powerful transition of leadership. There was no dramatic ceremony, no oversized scissors cutting a ribbon, just a handshake, a nod, and a shared understanding between father and son. David looked at Marcus not only with pride, but with the humility of a man who had seen the flaws in his creation and was wise enough to hand it over to someone who could build it better. He's not just the future, David said to the board in a closed-door meeting later that day. He's the correction we didn't know we needed. Within days, the changes Marcus had spoken about began rolling out, not in waves of fear, but through intentional people-first actions. Anonymous employee feedback boxes were placed on every floor. Department heads were invited to roundtable discussions, not just to report, but to listen. New hires received onboarding, not just about tasks and metrics, but about values and inclusion. People began to talk to each other differently. Conversations that were once laced with competition became moments of collaboration. Staff who had never been acknowledged before were being invited to speak, to contribute, to matter. The walls of Bennett Realty hadn't changed, but the spirit inside them had. Employees who had once viewed Marcus as just the janitor now looked to him with a new kind of reverence, not because of his power, but because of his clarity. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be unheard, and he carried that awareness into every decision he made. His leadership was not loud, it was not flashy, it was steady, thoughtful, and deeply personal. Even the most skeptical executives found themselves nodding during his meetings, not out of obligation, but because his words made sense. For the first time in years, the company didn't just have a leader, it had a compass. Stories began circulating in the office about how Marcus had quietly paid attention to hallway conversations, about how he remembered the names of every night shift worker, about how he kept the same mop cart in a corner of his office as a reminder of where he came from. It wasn't symbolic, it was intentional. A legacy built not on image but on truth. New employees entered the company, hearing the story of the janitor who became CEO, not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of what integrity looks like in action. The story didn't need embellishing. It lived in the culture now. And so a new era began at Bennett Realty Group 1, where respect was not earned through title but extended by default. One where leadership was about service, not status. And one where every person, regardless of their background, their role, or their appearance, was reminded daily that they mattered. Marcus Bennett had done more than take over a company. He had rewritten its story, And in doing so, he left behind a legacy, not just for the business, but for every soul who ever doubted their worth in the face of power. This wasn't just a corporate transformation. It was a human one. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of dignity, the cost of silence, or the strength it takes to lead with humility, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Deep Inside HQ for more real, powerful stories about transformation, truth, and the kind of leadership the world needs more of. And if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or treated unfairly, just remember your story isn't over. Sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that change everything.